One man's trash is another man's treasure, is how the saying goes. Basically, it means that what is worthless to one person can be very valuable to someone else. Can you think of some examples of that? Examples of something that is not valued by one person, but is valued by someone else? One example I can think of is the Ford Edsel. It was a car Ford offered in the late 1950s or so. I heard about some people hating it because of how it looked. The style of the grille reminded them of a toilet seat. On the other hand, other people like the car, particularly as a collectible vehicle today. Other examples I can think of are how one person might value country music while another person doesn't. One person might find value in energy drinks and another person can't stand them. One person might value truth while another person values how you can manipulate with lies. Maybe you can think of other examples that go with the saying, one man's trash is another man's treasure. I'm going to alter that saying a bit and say, one man's trash is God's treasure. Or, what is worthless to man is precious to God. What man and the world values and what God values are very different. And that is the topic I would like to explore today. Did you know some of the most valuable things are not valued, even amongst God's people? So don't be surprised when you see valuable things treated that way. Don't be surprised if those most valuable things are scorned and hated, as the Lord Himself was. As you come to Him, the living stone, rejected by men, but chosen and precious in God's sight. To you who believe, then, this stone is precious, but to those who do not believe, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. Some of the most valuable things there are not valued by man. So don't be surprised about this. Take it as a simple fact, albeit a sad one. I don't want you to be surprised about this, and I don't want it to make you think less of those things that are most valuable, and I don't want it to discourage you. Jesus Himself was rejected. The cornerstone was despised and rejected, killed, but He is precious to God. Besides Jesus Himself, what are some further examples of the difference between what God values and what man values? Here is one example from 1 Samuel chapter 16. For context, it is when Samuel was sent by God to anoint the new king God had chosen for Israel. Samuel didn't know exactly who it was yet. It was going to be David. But this was Samuel's reaction when he saw one of David's brothers. When they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, "Surely this is the Lord's anointed." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him." The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. I like that. I see that the Lord values the heart of a person over appearances. Man and the world generally put a high value on appearance, even above the heart of a person. Here is another example that is similar. For context, it is speaking to women. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as braided hair or gold jewelry or fine clothes, but from the inner disposition of your heart, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in God's sight. The point here is that the heart and character of a person is more valuable than their outward appearance. It says a gentle and quiet spirit is precious in God's sight. I was thinking about that, and personally, I do not see that sort of thing being very valuable in the world's point of view. Gentle and quiet seems pretty worthless if I think with my fleshly perspective. More like aggressive and loud is the way to go to be of much worth in this world. Even more than that, to be outwardly beautiful would be the way to go to be of much worth in this world if I was thinking in terms of my flesh. It is easy to see things in the perspective of my flesh. I'm glad that what God values and what man and the world values is very different. I hope not to get off topic too much, but I did want to add that I think the part about braided hair and gold jewelry and fine clothes could be taken out of context. The point of those verses is to show what is to be focused on and what is more valuable. It is speaking about what should be the primary source of one's beauty. It's not saying that if a girl braids her hair or wears gold jewelry or fine clothes that she is doing something wrong. Wearing the dreariest of clothing and wearing your hair in the most boring way is not somehow going to make you more righteous. It's the condition of your heart and character that matters more, whether you put effort into looking drab or looking pretty. I think it's very interesting that God thought this was worth putting in the Bible. I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of women spend an intense amount of time and effort on their physical appearance. There could be many reasons for that. I think one of the reasons is because how a woman appears is what makes them valuable in this world. People want to be valuable. They want to matter and be heard and thought of as something valuable. Anyway, it is refreshing and comforting to me to know that God looks at the heart of a person. I don't have to be pretty to be loved by Him. I like that very much, and for a long time I've hoped to become more like Him in this way of valuing people not based on how they look. I think that some people who basically have hearts of gold are sort of dismissed or passed over because they don't look attractive enough or something. I've seen it happen. As far as romantic sorts of relationships go, I have to admit that how someone looks plays a part in that, perhaps initially, but it never makes up for someone's bad character or unloving heart. Moving on, there are other things man in this world does not consider to be of much value, but is valuable to God. There are opposites in values all the way down the line. For instance, a person's position in life. Man and the world look at and consider hierarchy all the time. Positions of power and influence because a person has a certain job, or is wealthy, or has some kind of reputation. That matters a lot to the world and to man, and they will favor one person over another because of it. But how does God look at a person's position in life? For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, mighty, and awesome God, showing no partiality and accepting no bribe. And the leaders of the church had nothing to add to what I was preaching. By the way, their reputation as great leaders made no difference to me, for God has no favorites. But from those who seemed to be something, whatever they were, it makes no difference to me. God shows personal favoritism to no man, for those who seemed to be something added nothing to me. What I see here is that God shows no partiality and shows personal favoritism to no man. These positions of hierarchy, based on, like I said, having a certain job or being wealthy or having some kind of reputation, do not mean anything to God. Moving on, what about how people value food? Seems to me a lot of attention is paid toward food. I don't mean wise attention toward food, like obviously needing to eat good things to keep yourself healthy. I mean overly valuing food. Like I said, seems to me a lot of attention is paid toward food. Entire lifestyles can revolve around it. People's identities can be wrapped up in it. But how does the Lord view its level of importance? So when the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went across to Capernaum to look for him. They found him on the other side of the lake and asked, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" Jesus replied, "I tell you the truth. You want to be with me because I fed you, not because you understood the miraculous signs. But don't be so concerned about perishable things like food. Spend your energy seeking the eternal life that the Son of Man can give you. For God the Father has given me the seal of his approval." First, what I see here is Jesus pointing out how these people wanted to be with him because he fed them and not because they understood what he was doing. Also, I see that Jesus was telling them to spend their energy going after more valuable things, like eternal life, rather than being so concerned about perishable things like food. On to the next example. How about how people value possessions and wealth? I don't think I need to explain to you how people value possessions and wealth. I think it's obvious enough. So I'll move right along into what does the Lord say about it. And he said to them, "Watch out, guard yourselves against every form of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." What I see here is that this verse is self-explanatory. Moving on. What about people's pride in their own righteousness? Pride in their own righteousness. Let's take a look at this story Jesus told. Then Jesus told this story to some who had great confidence in their own righteousness and scorned everyone else. 2 men went to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, and the other was a despised tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed this prayer: "I thank you, God, that I am not like other people, cheaters, sinners, adulterers. I'm certainly not like that tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give you 1/10 of my income." But the tax collector stood at a distance and dared not even lift his eyes to heaven as he prayed. Instead, he beat his chest in sorrow, saying, "O God, be merciful to me, for I am a sinner." I tell you, this sinner, not the Pharisee, returned home justified before God. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Furthermore, a verse from Proverbs: "A man's pride will bring him low, but a humble spirit will obtain honor." What I see here is how man and the world value pride in their accomplishments to the point of seeing themselves as more righteous because of them. The world is rife with pride and sees no problem with it. But from these verses we can see that it is those who humble themselves that will be exalted and will obtain honor. In another verse it says that God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. I think you can see what God values here, as opposed to what man and the world values. What about how man and the world values how much you gave? How much you gave in terms of money. It is the quantity that is looked at. $5,000 is more impressive than $5. Frankly, it is more appreciated too. How did Jesus view how much a person gave? Jesus sat down near the collection box in the temple and watched as the crowds dropped in their money. Many rich people put in large amounts. Then a poor widow came and dropped in 2 small coins. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I tell you the truth, this poor widow has given more than all the others who are making contributions, for they gave a tiny part of their surplus, but she, poor as she is, has given everything she had to live on. Okay, Jesus is saying here how the widow gave more. How is that possible? Obviously, the rich people gave more, and she gave only 2 small coins. What made it more to the Lord was that she gave all she had. She gave everything she had to live on. The rich people were giving a tiny part of their surplus. What I see here is it's not the quantity of what you gave that the Lord values. It was the sacrifice of what you gave. Man and the world typically do not care about the sacrifice. It is the quantity that they care about. On to the next example. How about how man and the world values their own wisdom? Seems to me man values his own wisdom a great deal. Seems to me he believes he can figure out about everything he needs to and can control more than he really can. Man and the world think they're pretty smart as far as I can tell. I think this is related to the pride that I mentioned earlier. How does God view human wisdom? I know very well how foolish it sounds to those who are lost when they hear that Jesus died to save them, but we who are saved recognize this message as the very power of God. For God says, "I will destroy all human plans of salvation, no matter how wise they seem to be, and ignore the best ideas of men, even the most brilliant of them." So what about these wise men, these scholars, these brilliant debaters of this world's great affairs? God has made them all look foolish and shown their wisdom to be useless nonsense. For God, in his wisdom, saw to it that the world would never find God through human brilliance, and then he stepped in and saved all those who believed his message, which the world calls foolish and silly. It seems foolish to the Jews because they want a sign from heaven as proof that what is preached is true, and it is foolish to the Gentiles because they believe only what agrees with their philosophy and seems wise to them. So when we preach about Christ dying to save them, the Jews are offended and the Gentiles say it's all nonsense. But God has opened the eyes of those called to salvation, both Jews and Gentiles, to see that Christ is the mighty power of God to save them. Christ himself is the center of God's wise plan for their salvation. This so-called foolish plan of God is far wiser than the wisest plan of the wisest man. And God in his weakness, Christ dying on the cross, is far stronger than any man. What I see here is that the wisdom of man and the world will not win salvation for them. It says God made them all look foolish and shown their wisdom to be useless nonsense because God purposely made it so that he would not be found through human brilliance. God's wisdom is greater than the wisdom of man. In other ways, human wisdom can be useful, but not when it comes to knowing God. Moving on. How about how man and the world value physical exercise? Seems to me a lot of attention is paid toward physical exercise. Some exercise is good for you, but it seems to me some people give undue attention to it. Like with the food example, entire lifestyles can revolve around it. People's identities can get wrapped up in it. To me, this can merge into the way man and the world value appearances. But how does the Lord view its level of importance? Have nothing to do with godless myths and old wives' tales. Rather, train yourself to be godly. For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. What I see here is that physical exercise or training is not totally worthless, but pay more attention to what has more value, which is godliness. When's the last time you heard anybody say, train yourself to be godly? More often, I've heard of training the physical body. Over and over again, God is looking at something that man is not. He is evaluating something man is not. Something man either scoffs at or does not think about at all. Over and over again, God is showing us what is of greater value. My list of examples is not comprehensive, by the way. I'm sure you can discover more examples of the difference between what man values versus what God values. Certain things are precious to God, regardless of what anyone else thinks. These things are not precious because others say so, but because God says so. It is like that with many things. It is not so because others say so, but because God says so. Man cannot create truth. He can only agree or disagree with truth. He can only agree or disagree with what God says. Remember how Jesus was valued and treated by man and the world. Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This is from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes." The stone the builders rejected. They rejected him. That is how man and the world treat and view the things that are precious to God. That is how Jesus is still viewed by the majority. The things most precious to God are scorned, mocked, or hated by man and the world. That's the way it is. When I say man, I mean unregenerate man. I mean the flesh part of us. I believe as we become more like our Lord, we will value what He values more and more. We will share His values. What is precious to Him will become precious to us. It's a simple prayer, but I've found myself many times asking the Lord to help me value what He values and to not value what He doesn't. Don't be fooled. What is precious to God is not precious to the world. Never was, never will be. Know that the world and God do not share the same values. In fact, they are opposed to one another. You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? Therefore, whoever chooses to be a friend of the world renders himself an enemy of God. The Pharisees, who loved money, heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight." I said earlier about how this is a simple fact. It is knowledge that basically what man and the world do not value is valued by God. What man doesn't value or perhaps doesn't consider at all is highly esteemed by God. I intend for this knowledge to be more than a fact that is thought about briefly and then forgotten about. I don't intend for it to be a useless fact, as if I were telling you that I was born in Seattle, Washington, a useless fact that might be interesting for a moment and then is useless. This knowledge I've been talking about is useful to keep in mind and take along with you through this Christian life. Think of this Christian life as a long hike, and this knowledge about the difference in values between God and man as a useful tool for you to put in your backpack and take along with you. Personally, I think it's good to keep this knowledge in mind because it helps me. For one, I won't be expecting anything different. It isn't a surprise to me. It isn't a shock. It's like what man and the world values are opposite of what God values. A very consistent and predictable opposite. Keeping this in mind helps me in a few ways. It helps me to not be so discouraged when I see undesirable things being valued so much, because that is expected. It is expected that man and the world does not value what God does. It helps me keep a clear distinction between God's ways versus the ways of man and the world. Subsequently, this helps me know which way to go in decisions I make or what kinds of thoughts to think. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Stand firm with your God. Know where your allegiance stands. It stands with Him. Know where your life is aiming, and know who your God is. Know the difference between what He values and what your flesh and the world values. It is good for Christians to remember these things in order to refocus. Sometimes things in life can cause one to get out of focus. It is good to refocus from time to time so that one has the proper perspective of things. Clarity, focus, direction. Life becomes less muddled when a person has these things. This is especially necessary for Christians, as we are living in a world where we are foreigners. May we not lose perspective and begin to think this world is our home, as if we ought to acclimate ourselves to it and its values. It is true that what man values is highly different than what God values. And it is good for Christians to know it and remember it. Let's know the difference so we don't get it mixed up and let it skew our perspective and thinking. This is helpful in the life we are trying to live as Christians. As our values mirror God's values, we will look odd in this world we're living in because we have a totally different set of values. It's no wonder we should be looking odd. And if we are going to live out this Christian life, it is helpful that we accept and embrace this fact of having different values than the world does. If we don't, it's harder for us. It's like trying to play baseball, but by the rules of football. It's hard, if not impossible. You're trying to play two different games. That's how it's like if you are trying to live this Christian life, but you are still valuing the things your flesh and the world does. It's like you're living with two different sets of values. Make up your mind to stick to one or the other. Dear friends, I warn you as temporary residents and foreigners to keep away from worldly desires that wage war against your very souls. Personally, I have found it relieving to value what God values more and more. It's easier on me as I try to live this Christian life. I don't have to play the world's games anymore. I'm not running the rat race anymore. I'm running a totally different race. I hope you get what I'm trying to say. I don't need to play the world's games anymore in terms of needing to amend everything I do or say or look in order to be valued, because God values me, and I've at least grown up enough to know that that is what matters most. I don't need to live up to the world's expectations or man-made religious traditions. I don't need to run endlessly after acquiring possessions, temporal wealth, or even achieving positions of supposed power in life, because I have all those things with God in ways that will not pass away. I don't need to care so much about pleasing people as long as I'm pleasing God. To me, it has been a much more simple way to live, and it is a relief. All I really need to do is keep following after the Lord, loving and obeying Him. Finally, it's good to remember that God's values are different than man's values, because it helps to straighten a Christian's perspective. Like I said before, sometimes things in life can cause one to get out of focus. The other day, I went with a friend to my local gun range. They went to the range because they needed to adjust their scope to a new rifle they got. I just went along to accompany them. I don't know that much about firearms, but I watched as they took a long-range shot and then adjusted these knobs and things on their scope. Then they fired another round and made further adjustments on their scope. This was repeated several times. To me, it's kind of like that when I remember what God values versus what my flesh values. When I start to consider valuing something God doesn't, it gets me off focus. For example, when I start to consider what people think of me over what God thinks of me, it can get me off focus. When I remember what God values, it's like adjusting one of the knobs on a scope. It helps me realign my perspective so I don't get off track. I want to shoot straight, after all. I know what I'm aiming at. I want to be tuned in properly. As Christians, if we know what we're aiming at, it helps a great deal to remember what we ought to be valuing most. It's good to remember to refocus from time to time so that one has the proper perspective of things and can aim right on target.